see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch from the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and today I'm here with Ed O'Brien and Phoebe Ellsworth from the University of Michigan. And thank you so much for both of you for joining me here for this dialogue about empathy and your study.
Thanks, Edwin. Yeah.
So you came out with a study recently that's gotten a bit of media attention. And so I wanted to talk to you about the study and hear a little bit about it. And some of the articles that have come out about it have been, like there was one in the Time magazine by Maya Salovitz that she said, why Republicans and Democrats can't feel each other's pain. And then in another magazine is empathy doesn't extend across the political aisle. So it seemed to be kind of related to your study was related to how people view each other and empathize with each other and kind of political from different political parties or backgrounds. Would you like to just introduce yourselves a bit and just talk a little bit about your study?
Sure, that'd be great. Well, thank you for having us again. So I'm Ed. I'm a PhD student here at Michigan, and Phoebe's my advisor. And we became interested in this project because we started talking about a lot of the ways that people kind of naturally empathize with other people or naturally kind of take the perspective of others. So we kind of are predisposed to see each other as similar to one another, especially when we're in some kind of strong emotional state. So usually when people are really hungry or really thirsty, it's really hard to not think about being hungry or being thirsty. So when asked to think about what other people might be feeling, we're kind of prone to say the same thing. So when I myself am really hungry, I kind of perceive others as also really hungry. This is a really kind of strong state that we get ourselves in.
So if I'm here and I'm seeing both of you over there and I'm feeling really hungry, I kind of project onto you that you must be hungry as well. Or if I'm very nervous, maybe I was like nervous about doing the dialogue or interview, I would think, oh, you're probably nervous too.
Exactly. So usually we get ourselves into these states that are so strong that we kind of just assume that other people are feeling them. It's hard to think about them outside of the box.
So in a way, the default position is to assume that other people are like us.
Okay. So right. Yeah, we tend to think people are like us in terms of what we're feeling and experiencing.
Right.
Okay. Exactly. So what we're interested in is kind of pitting these really, really strong feelings that people can get themselves in, like feeling hungry or feeling cold or feeling nervous, with another thing that goes on when we think about other people, which is kind of feeling dissimilar to them, maybe on some incidental domain, like we disagree on a belief or we have different values. Because other research that we were looking at shows that when we feel really dissimilar to somebody else, we often kind of distance ourselves from their situation. So if I like a certain type of song or certain type of food, I might not project that onto people who I don't like or people who are really different from me. I kind of remove my own preferences from the situation. So we're interested in looking at kind of pitting these really strong, more emotional feelings like feeling cold or feeling thirsty versus kind of feeling psychologically dissimilar, the strong sense that we're not like somebody else. When you both feel really strong, if you're in a state of hunger, but you also feel dissimilar to somebody else, kind of which strong influence wins out.
Mm. And this was, you had written it up in a paper I have up here, more than skin deep, visceral states are not projected onto dissimilar others. Is that the?
That's right. That's correct.
And so how did this, how did the findings work? Like, how did you set up the experiment and how did it, what happened?
So again, we wanted to pit kind of a strong physiological state versus a strong psychological. In our first study, we wanted to get some participants who were going to be in a really, really cold state. We wanted them to be in the strong state of feeling cold. So we approached people in Ann Arbor, and Ann Arbor has quite a cold winter. So yes. For half of our participants, we just approached them as they're waiting at a bus stop outside in January. So it's very, very cold. They're naturally kind of already standing there. And for another group of participants, we went to kind of a nearby indoor library area. So kind of similar standing outside in the cold, and one is standing inside. So that was kind of our first manipulation of getting somebody to feel strong. But then we also wanted to manipulate psychological dissimilarities. So what we did was give people a short story to read and answer some questions. Feeling. And what we did was manipulate whether the protagonist was kind of this strong left-wing Democrat hike and getting lost in the winter. So all of a sudden, the participant now has to guess, you know, how cold, how hungry, how thirsty this person might be feeling.
So let me say, so you're at a bus stop, and people are sitting out at the bus stop waiting for the bus. Is that
exactly.
right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And they're all bundled up, and they're like really cold there because it's a cold winter there, and with snow, I imagine, on the ground, and or at least
early January last year, actually, right in Ann Arbor. So very, very cold.
Okay, and then you're saying, here's this story. Read this story.
Exactly.
Right.
And the story is if. Did you know if they were Democrats or Republicans to begin with? That was one of the questions.
Right, right. To begin with, we didn't. So after they did this main task, which I can get to in detail now, at the very end, we kind of assessed their own political values and things like that to make sure, you know, if people felt similar to this protagonist, they, you know, what kind of political beliefs did they have as well. So what we did was we gave people this story, and as Phoebe said earlier, kind of people's natural tendency when they read something like that is, again, to project their own strong states. It's really hard to not think of not being cold when you yourself are cold. So what we would normally expect to find is that if you're sitting outside in the bus stop in Ann Arbor and it's really, really cold, and you have to read about somebody who's kind of caught outside in the winter, you're very, very likely to say that that person's also cold. Because I'm cold right now, it's hard not to think of being cold, so I project that coldness onto others. That's kind of the standard thing that people tend to do.
And they do it even when they don't know anything about the other person, whether they're a Democrat or a Republican, but with no information, they'll tend to say, yeah, he's probably really cold.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So they kind of use their own state as a basis to make a judgment about this other person. What we were interested in is whether people would do that equally when they read about a Democrat and they read about a Republican, in relation to whether they themselves were a Democrat or a Republican. But what we found is that in one sense, we replicated what we thought we were going to find when people matched in political values. So if I'm a Democrat and I read about this lost Democrat, well, I'm really cold right now on the bus stop. I bet this person's really cold. Kind of projection that you were talking about. But the interesting part was when participants read about somebody with the opposite political values. So again, if I'm a Democrat now reading about this Republican who's also kind of lost outside in the cold, I was no more likely to say that that person was cold, whether I was cold myself or whether I was warm. So despite the fact that I'm feeling very cold myself, we have this strong kind of drive state that we're in. People seem to not be really affected by that. They weren't really looking towards that when judging this person who had opposite political values.
So how does this relate to empathy, would you say? Because I was kind of going through this, and I mean, there's different aspects of empathy. Was it actually, were you actually looking in this in terms of like how it affects empathy, or is this something that all these writers have kind of projected onto your work?
Yeah. I think empathy is a component that we were interested in. I mean, at a more basic level, we're kind of interested in how do people kind of figure out what others are feeling or thinking. So definitely in that sense, you know, empathy is a large component. But we were interested in also, you know, when people fail to maybe look upon their own states when making judgments of others. In other words, I think the findings might suggest that one way that people can empathize with others is kind of putting themselves in the other person's shoes and kind of gaining experience into their world. So if I really want to empathize with somebody who's struggling with feeling cold, maybe a homeless person during wintertime, you know, it might help if I put myself in a cold state and I realize, oh yeah, being cold, you know, has all of these horrible negative effects, and maybe it's going to inspire me to give more to a charity to people in need in that same state.
And the other thing is that we sort of have a natural empathy that if we're feeling a certain way and we're asked about some random other person, we use ourselves to infer what that person's probably feeling or what they believe or how early they get up in the morning. So that the sort of assumption is that people are like us. And what we found was there are limits to that. And for certain groups, we assume us, or we don't assume that they are like us.
Yeah, so it's like, how do we assume people are kind of like us and not like us, and how does that kind of relate to how we feel towards them? Is that, maybe I'm not saying that very well.
No, I think that's right. And I think what, you know, an example would be, you know, usually when we try to figure out somebody else, we kind of use our own preferences and values as a template. So if I really don't want to get an ear piercing or a tattoo, I might vastly overestimate the number of people in the general population who also hate tattoos and piercings. I kind of like something, other people probably don't like it too. But I think the interesting thing that we found in this study was that despite having kind of a strong thing to rely on, so I'm feeling very cold, I'm feeling very thirsty, other people probably feel that way too, what we found is that if you feel really dissimilar to somebody, you're far less likely to be influenced by that, which kind of, as Phoebe suggested, kind of suggests there's maybe some kind of limit to our ability to see ourselves connected.
Yeah, so yeah, it was kind of, the word there was the other perspective, because it kind of depends on what the definitions of empathy are, and kind of the difference, because we're kind of, it seems like you're looking at, I mean, there's sympathy and empathy, so we have kind of a differentiation between those different experiences, and then there's kind of like an emotional empathy, and then kind of a cognitive perspective taking empathy. So the emotional empathy is maybe through mirror neurons, where we kind of reflect what someone else is going through. For example, so if you're at the bus stop and you see someone else shivering and shaking, you're kind of mirroring that in yourself in terms of a felt body sensation through mirror neurons. And then there's kind of the other part of empathy, which is more the perspective taking. So it looked like you were kind of looking at the perspective taking part of empathy more, if I don't understand it.
Well, I think that face with somebody to feel an emotional empathy, that you can read about people suffering. It's not necessary, and mirror neurons are not necessary empathy either. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, a person who's, when you're just projecting how cold you are, that seems more emotional and visceral to me than some sort of high-level cognitive perspective taking.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Yeah,
so it's really like when you're experiencing something, what it's that quality of, do we just project it onto others?
Right, and I think sticking with, you brought up the framework of kind of this mirror neuron system. So I think one thing we were looking at is this cognitive level or you know, emotional, affective level of empathic concern or something. The idea is when you yourself gain the experience of someone else. So whether that's through a mirror neuron reaction, me actually feeling cold, or me actually might be like from their perspective. The idea is that typically helps us empathize with somebody else. So putting ourselves in the situation that they might realize what that experience is like. one potential implication of our findings is that even when you give people that experience, so if I really want to understand what it's like for someone to go through pain, so maybe I myself might put myself in a brief burst of pain or something like that to kind of understand that situation. What our findings might suggest is that even when I'm given that experience, I might not let that knowledge affect my judgments of people who are kind of incidentally dissimilar to me. Maybe we share different values or something. It shouldn't have anything to do with whether they are capable of feeling pain, but I'm not going to let my own kind of experience affect that prediction.
So what is it that this is the block then? Like you're saying that there's this block to empathy. Is it like judgment, or do you know what I'm saying? Did the block to empathy to seeing if I'm a Democrat and I'm looking at a Republican and I'm not really feeling, what they're feeling, is it because of judgments? You know what I'm saying? There's some kind of a block to that. You were kind of pointing out there are some blocks to that connection. Did you have a sense of what those blocks were? Is that maybe judgment, or I don't know, what would...
Well, there's a fundamental tendency for people to classify other people into members of their in-group or members of an out-group. And when you know nothing about somebody, you're likely to include them provisionally in the in-group. So, I mean, your question is about what does it take to define somebody as a member of the out-group. And we only did it so far with strong conservatives. So, I mean, one interesting set of follow-ups is what other kinds of divisions would block this empathic ability?
Right, and I think Phoebe and I have talked about that a lot recently. So maybe one answer to your question is, are people kind of blocking themselves out from another's perspective because they dislike that person? They feel a sense of hatred or rivalry or something like that, and they refuse to even picture them in the same room. Or maybe it's just kind of, it doesn't have to involve disliking, but it's just hard to imagine life from their perspective. So maybe it's just that we don't have much experiences or kind of voting on the other side of the issue. So even if we don't dislike the other person, it might just be hard to picture the world through their shoes.
Yeah, because I like to watch both Fox and MSNBC, and I kind of switch between the two, kind of just seeing what all the sides say. And my partner, she comes in the room, and she sees Fox, and she says, "Those idiots!" And I say, "No, you got to listen to all sides." He says, "No, they're just wrong. They're just idiots." And so I think that's a little bit of what you're talking about there. She just cannot get where they're coming from. And I say, well, you have to empathize with conservatives. You have to hear what it is that where they're coming from. And I could just say, just as an anecdote, I've been to like the Tea Party rallies and to the Republican State Convention and to the Democratic Convention and gone and asked people, tell me about empathy. What's the role of empathy in your life? So this has, your study has real kind of overlap, I think, with just that experience. So you're kind of talking about my girlfriend here.
That was not our intention.
I think that you're in a small minority that flips back and forth between Fox and MSNBC.
Yeah. And I think one interesting point that you made me think of is, so one thing we didn't find was that, Democrats showed our effect more than Republicans, kind of independent voters. So it seemed like people were failing to kind of empathize with dissimilar others equally across the board. At the same time, you can imagine kind of a stereotypical big college campus here. We had majority Democrat participants. It was somewhat harder to find people who self-reported as Republican or independent or something else. But at least from the data that we have, it looks like whether I'm a Democrat or Republican or something else, I'm showing this effect equally. So it's not
okay.
Republicans failing to empathize or Democrats failing to empathize.
Yeah, because Democrats tend to think of themselves as big empathizers, and you're kind of saying, hey, you know, you're really not as empathic as you think you are, you know, maybe.
Yeah.
It's like it's equal. You're saying it's pretty much equally unempathic. So it's, how about, did you look at what would be considered moderates? Because moderates tend to be kind of half Democrat and half Republican in that sense in the value system, and they switch between the two.
But they're rare.
But they're rare. They were hard to find in Ann Arbor, at least at our study. And you can imagine, I would guess that one thing you do need, as Phoebe was talking about earlier, is at least some degree of this in-group, out-group type of mentality. So if you're truly on the fence, then, you know, using our actual study of Republicans and Democrats as protagonists might not have a huge effect on you. I think maybe moderates feel strongly about one particular issue where if they read about somebody who disagrees with them on that issue, you might find the effect. But the issue of just in general, how do moderates react, I think is kind of interesting. We had a handful of them in our study.
They determine the elections for the whole country, so they're kind of a really pretty important group, because I guess Ohio would be a good place to go to find those moderates there who seem to swing the election one way or another.
Yeah, and actually, now that I think of it, it would be kind of interesting to see. I mean, I guess it could go one of two ways. So one is that moderates can easily empathize with a Republican or Democrat equally, or they might just struggle to empathize with Democrats and Republicans equally, depending on kind of how active they are, depending on if they really favor one side or the other.
Right. So if they identify as, I'm a sane person who doesn't hold these wild, extreme attitudes, then they might not be able to empathize with anybody.
Yeah, they seem to empathize with one side or the other during the election when it comes down to it, and everybody's kind of struggling to get them to empathize with us. No, empathize with us. They're kind of in the middle a little bit there. So it seems like your work kind of really overlaps then with any kind of in-group, out-group. It could be religion.
Well, we would bet that that's true. We've only studied one group so far, but and it may be that some out-groups, for example, I think that if men read about a woman lost in the woods, they empathize. Some group differences may matter and others not.
Yeah, so that's kind of more areas for study then. I'm still thinking, do you see a difference between sympathy and empathy? Because, you know, sympathy, I mean, empathy is if I'm looking at you now, you can't see me because we turned the camera off, but I do see you, and I see Ed, you smiling, you know, you just had a big smile. And if I empathize with you, I'm kind of like picking up the energy that, you know, I'm through mirror neurons, or I'm taking your perspective, empathic perspective. But then sympathy tends to be me, how I'm feeling about you. If I see that you're very angry, I might become fearful. Or if I see you in pain, I could be very sorrowful. I could feel sorrow for you. So that would be kind of like sympathy, right? Because I'm not just feeling and empathizing with you. I'm kind of bringing in my own, you know, sense of sorrow.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm trying to relate how that might, what kind of implications we could draw from the studies that we ran for that. So, so again, in one sense, it's like if I myself am hungry, but I perceive a homeless person as very, very dissimilar from me. In theory, based on our findings, I might not project my own hunger onto them. I might not realize kind of their plight. But in terms of kind of sympathy and empathy, it would be interesting to look at. I might still very much feel bad for them. I mean, it's hard to look at somebody in need and just purely not sympathize on some. But if I'm removing myself from the situation at some point, I might not, you know, vote for something that could help them out or motivated enough to volunteer on the weekend or something like that. But I might still kind of have that gut emotional reaction.
Yeah, well, that gut reaction, could be sympathy in the sense that, oh, I feel sorrowful for that person on the street there, and I feel bad about him, and it can maybe even lead to like pity, right? Which is really not an empathic process. An empathy would be, you know, maybe kind of seeing who that person is, and actually maybe a deeper empathy would be really hearing who they are.
Right. Our research really, if you were going to say whether empathy, because you're projecting the same state that you feel onto somebody else, and usually that's how empathy is defined, that one person feels another person's pain or pleasure or whatever, and sympathy is that you react, that you care about them, you react to them, but you're not matching their feelings.
Yeah, it's more of a reactive. Sympathy would be more of a reactive kind of a experience then.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So your suggestion about the mirror neurons really made me think it would be a great study to put two people who knew they were very dissimilar into a mirror neuron study and see whether one person's mirror neurons didn't respond so quickly to the other person anymore.
Yeah, put them in an fMRI kind of situation. I've seen some studies like that where they pinch, you know, inflict pain, and you can kind of see if the pain is reflected in the person that's in the fMRI.
Uh-huh.
So.
Yeah, and I know actually one of the studies that inspired us to use this Democrat-Republican manipulation was an fMRI study. And I think what they were looking at, it wasn't really empathy or sympathy per se, but if I'm a Democrat and I imagine a Republican going through some kind of painful experience, the parts of my brain that are involved are those that purely process how someone else behaves. But if I'm a Democrat and I imagine the type of pain that a Democrat goes through, not only is my brain responding like that's another person, but the same areas kind of that are active when I think about myself also become active. Mm-hmm. So at least at the neurological level, similar others seem to activate kind of self-referencing and also other referencing. Whereas when somebody's really dissimilar from us, even at the level of the brain, we're kind of processing them differently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, are you interested in empathy? Is that kind of? I mean, I'm kind of wondering how you're coming at this. Like, what is I'm like obsessed with how do we build a culture of empathy? How do we create a society where we raise the value of empathy, you know, in society? And the articles, you know, that were kind of written about your study tended to kind of reference that, say, well, you know, empathy. There's these blocks to empathy, and so I'm kind of wondering, how does empathy play in your personal interest in doing these studies?
Yeah. So one thing I think that still interests me from our findings is that this kind of lay intuition or kind of folk wisdom that putting ourselves in somebody else's shoes, gaining their experience helps. With somebody else. So one thing that we might be finding is that that's not always the case. So in one sense, I'm interested in looking at situations in which we kind of fail to do that, and what usually works to empathize with somebody else doesn't work.
Oh, I see. So there's a lot of these programs, especially in the colleges. It's like, let's get the college students to go spend the night as just like a street person, you know, living on the street and see what it kind of feels like. Exactly. And this is going to somehow kind of really build their empathy. And you're saying that, hey, maybe that's not the case.
Exactly. Yeah. So in one sense, it might be just as, if not more important, to spend a night, you know, thinking about how similar you are to somebody else. Kind of trying to see past often incidental differences, like we disagree on a certain value, we disagree on a certain belief that may not or should not come into play when I'm kind of empathizing with them. It may be more important to think about similarities rather than simply gaining their experience, because that experience might not help at all if we feel really dissimilar to them.
Oh, so the foundation, you're kind of looking for what is your common values, your common feelings, and then kind of build from there.
Well, and it might not even need to be important values. I mean, a long time ago, I did some research on people's how punitive they felt towards various serious criminals, and found that if you tell them a few trivial humanizing details about the criminal's life, like he eats Cheerios for breakfast or he has a dog, people are much more lenient towards him. That it shows they're thinking him as so totally nothing in common with. No punishment is too bad for him.
Oh, so it's really about finding some commonalities then, looking for commonalities, and those commonalities kind of humanize each other.
It's a good. Gave them more information about this political opponent that was very like things about themselves, then I don't know what would happen. Whether you could bring group or not.
Right. So yeah. So going back to your question about kind of our basic interest in empathy.
Oh yeah.
One thing that we were trying to get at was, I guess you could say, what's more important if you're trying to make a formula for how to empathize with somebody else? Should you first gain experience? Should you put yourself in their shoes? Go out and, like you said, these programs that are designed to kind of spend a night doing X that somebody else would do? Or is it more important to kind of, well, first kind of realize that you're similar and that those experiences might actually match up? And what I think we may have been finding in our studies is that the best first step is to kind of make yourself realize the similarities between you and somebody else before even putting yourself in their shoes.
And do you have ideas of how to do that in the Republican conservative? I mean, the conservative progressive conflict that we have. Did you have some kind of ideas for how to do that, or is it just we need to do it, but not sure how to do it?
I don't think anybody wants to do it.
Yeah.
That everybody's going completely out of their way to emphasize themselves as diametrically opposed on everything. So there's strong forces pushing in the opposite direction to the one you're recommending.
Yeah. Although Phoebe and I were talking about kind of these classic social psychology studies on giving people a bigger goal that they could have in common, where they could almost kind of need each other to fulfill some specific part in order to get that mutual goal. So you see this oftentimes in classroom settings where on individual parts of a group project, or even to need each other in order to get that final grade. So I think you can probably in the political realm where Republicans and Democrats are both vying for this problem or bigger goal that they would both benefit from. We were talking about maybe if there's an enemy attack or something like that, all of a sudden this new bigger outgroup that all of a sudden these smaller in-group outgroups kind of come together. You can imagine that could foster some sort of empathy.
Yeah, it's that whole in-group out-group, but then it's just perpetuating the in-group out-group paradigm, right? It's like how do we change the whole paradigm so we get rid of the in-group out-group and create I mean, that's kind of what my interest is how do we create that culture of empathy where we don't see the in-groups and out-groups. And
it's hard to think of a culture that's managed to do that successfully.
Well,
no, we were sort of lamenting the fact that the best way to bring two groups together is to have a common enemy. So you've got a bigger outgroup that can unite you, and that doesn't seem like a very satisfactory solution from your point of view.
Yeah, maybe we need. It's like to unify the world, we need an alien invader or something.
That's right.
Well, I do have hope in empathy that if people learned more about empathy and how empathy works and how to empathize, that they would go out and connect with each other and really try to hear, each other. It's just like I was talking about, going to the Republican convention, going to the Democratic convention, and actually, saying, how do we create more empathy in the world? And actually hearing both sides, because it seems like with the different sides, they both feel that they're right and they're just not hearing each other. So
what do they say about how to create more empathy in the world? Do they say the same thing?
Well, what's so interesting is the Republicans, when I went to the Tea Party, they said, we're not being heard. Nobody's hearing us. And they just said it over and over again. And then I went to the Occupy movement, and it's like, we're not being heard. Nobody's listening to us.
So that's a common similarity that if they recognize, maybe could oddly bring them together.
There you go. It's like if both sides knew that the other side feels unheard, that they would have a commonality right there. Yeah. So that might be something to bring people together around that. So somehow it's like, how do we create a framework so people can sit down and even kind of hear each other, around that. I mean, I have a lot of stories, around, talking to Republicans. I don't want to kind of take up too much time here because, kind of want to focus more on kind of what you're kind of working on. But so, okay. Is there any other aspects of your study that you felt that wasn't covered in our dialogue so far that you would like to talk about? Oh, I guess one question would be, have you read some of the articles about your studies, like the one by Maya Salovitz in Time? And I was just wondering what your reaction were to some of those articles, if they kind of got what you were talking about.
Yeah, we actually have the one that you referenced on us now. I think it's a fairly accurate overview of what we did. I mean, one thing I think that they could extend upon is that it's not necessarily Republican Democrat, but as Phoebe was saying, kind of this just in general, like in-group, out-group findings. But it's also interesting to read, as you probably know from running your website, the message board comments of people either agreeing with us and all of a sudden reflecting some of the stuff we might have been finding in the lab.
Right. That we're either the out-group or the in-group.
Yeah.
Oh, that you guys were on the out-group? I didn't quite catch that. Could you just repeat that?
Well, it's funny sometimes looking at message board comments of people who so strongly disagree with our findings that they all of a sudden, immediately put us in some out-group research world or out-group, you don't know anything about how people actually act in everyday life and things like that. So.
Oh, so you're kind of getting criticism and judged and kind of being,
group out group type of mentality from the comments.
So you know what it's like to be in the out group now.
Well, I'm sure you do as well.
Yeah, I think we all know how that is, and it's like, how do we create a world where everyone is kind of accepted? I mean, I see that.
Words. Get rid of message boards. That's what you
get message boards. Well, you go into any kind of.
In an era without message boards,
that's true.
And everybody wasn't accepted.
Yeah. Well, you go into a room, right? You go into a room and you can feel like, oh, I'm not accepted here. I'm in the out group, and it's painful. It hurts to be in the out group, and it's like, how do we create a world where everybody's heard and seen and kind of included? So. I'm really grateful for you taking the time to share your studies on this and talk with me about it. And I hope we can keep in contact about this whole topic. And, if you do more work around empathy, and would sure love to hear about it. Do you have other studies coming up around this topic or expanding on it?
We were interested in, we kind of bring up, maybe it's a good summer project to run different levels of similarity, or whether it is, do I need to hate the Republicans in order to, if I'm a Democrat, in order to show these effects, or do I just need to feel like just dissimilar but not really hating them, something like that. You actually had covered about 2 years ago one of my other advisors here is Sarah Conrath. And we had a paper, she had a paper that I helped her on, looking at declining empathy in college students. And I think you covered that.
Oh, yeah, that was a big study. Yeah, I remember that.
Generational, potentially, you know, generational decline. So maybe this is all kind of related in some way, and just interested in looking at when people seem to not display when they're around people who are really different than them.
Sorry, the video is kind of broken up a little bit, and I didn't hear that last part. I mean, the audio.
Okay, yeah. Just in general, maybe these studies kind of come together, looking at how, under what conditions do people fail to do the things that they naturally do, such as feel empathy for someone else, take somebody else's perspective, you know, kind of project their own states onto others. It could be an interesting question that gets at maybe a more basic difference, inhibiting a lot of the things that you're talking about.
Oh. Yeah, I call it the blocks to empathy. So it's, you're kind of saying, well, what are the things that are blocking empathic connection between people? Because you're saying that Sarah's work was saying that there's more blocks to empathy among college students now. And it's like, what are those blocks? How do those blocks work? And how can we overcome those blocks to create more connection between people?
Right, exactly. We're in an election. Technology's developed, like we're able to Skype and kind of see the country, how these things as they maybe help connections between people or things like that.
Yeah, we sure need that in the political sphere. It's so dysfunctional. So
Right.
we need your work. Get busy.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you. It's just a real pleasure talking with both of you and hearing about this. And let's keep in contact.
Okay.
That'd be great.
Let you know our next exciting result.
Yes, definitely. Okay, well, I'll help publicize it too, get it out too.
Okay. Well,
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, take care.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.